you write about social justice. You write about two kinds of social justice: liberal social justice and SJF, social justice fundamentalism. What are those?
Yeah, so like the term wokeness is so loaded with baggage. It's kind of like mocking and derogatory, and I was trying not to do that in this book. Um, if it's the terms loaded with baggage, you're already kind of you're from the first minute you're already behind. So to me, it also that when people say wokeness is bad, social justice is bad, they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because the proudest tradition in the U.S. is liberal social justice, and what I mean by that, again, liberal meaning with lowercase l, it is intertwined with liberalism. So Martin Luther King, classic example, his "I Have a Dream" speech, he says stuff like, "This country, has made a promise to all of its citizens, and it has broken that promise to its Black citizens." Right? In other words, liberalism, the Constitution, the core ideals, those are great. We're not living up to them. We're failing on some of them. So civil disobedience, the goal of it wasn't to hurt liberalism. It was to specifically break the laws that were already violating that were the laws that were a violation of liberalism, to expose that this is illiberal, that the Constitution should not have people of different skin color sitting in different parts of the bus. And so it was kind of it was really patriotic, the civil rights movement. It was saying this is a beautiful, we have a liberalism is this beautiful thing, and we need to do better at it. So I call it liberal social justice, and it used the tools of liberalism to try to improve the flaws that were going on. So free speech, Mario Savio in the 60s was he's a leftist. And what were the leftists doing in the 60s on Berkeley campus? They were saying we need more free speech, because that's what liberal social justice was fighting for. But you can also go back to the 20s, women's suffrage. I mean, so the emancipation, the thing that America obviously has all of its these are all ugly things that it had to get out of, but it got out of them, one by one, and it's still getting out of them. That's what's cool about America. And liberal social justice basically is the practice of saying, where are we not being perfect liberals, and now let's fix that.
So that's the idea of liberalism that permeates the history of the United States. But then there's Interplay. You have so many good images in this book, but one of them is highlighting the interplay of different ideas over the past, let's say, 100 years. So liberalism is on one side. There's that thread. There's Marxism on the other, and then there's postmodernism. How do those interplay together?
So it's interesting because Marxism is, and all of its various, descendants, obviously there's a lot of things that are rooted in Marxism that aren't, the same thing as what Karl Marx preached. But what do they all have in common? They think liberalism is bad, right? They actually think that the opposite of what Martin Luther King and other people in the civil rights and other movements, they think the opposite. He thinks, liberalism is good, we need to preserve it. They said liberalism is the problem. These other problems with racism and inequality that we're seeing, those are inevitable results of liberalism. Liberalism is a rigged game, and it's just the power games in disguise. There is no liberal games. It's just the power games in disguise, and there's the upper people that oppress the lower people, and they convince the lower people, it's all about false consciousness, they convince the lower people that everything is fair, and now the lower people vote against their own interests, and they work to preserve the system that's oppressing them. And what do we need to do? We need to actually, there's much more revolutionary, we need to overthrow liberalism, right? So people think what we call wokeness is just, a normal social justice activism, but it's like more extreme, right? It's this, no, it's the polar opposite. And so now that's the Marxist thread. Now, postmodernism is kind of, this term that is super controversial, and I don't think anyone calls themselves a postmodernist, so take all of this with a grain of salt in terms of the term. But what's the definition of radical? The definition of radical to me is how deep you want change to happen at. So a liberal progressive and a conservative progressive will disagree about policies. The liberal progressive wants to, change a lot of policies, change, right? And the conservative wants to keep things the way they are. but they're both conservative when it comes to liberalism. Beneath it, the liberal kind of foundation of the country, they both become conservatives about that.
Mhm.
The Marxist is more radical because they want to go one notch deeper and actually overthrow that foundation. Now, what's below liberalism is kind of the core tenets of modernity. This idea of reason and the notion that there is an objective truth and um, science as the scientific method, right? These things are actually beneath, and even the Marxist. If you look at the Frankfurt School, these post-Marxist thinkers and Marx himself, they were not anti-science. They believed in that bottom foundation. They were actually wanted to preserve modernity, but they wanted to get rid of liberalism on top of it. The postmodernists is even more radical because they want to actually go down to the bottom level and overthrow it. They think science itself is a tool of oppression. They think it's a tool where oppression kind of flows through. They think that the white Western world has invented these concepts like, they claim that there's an objective truth and that there's, reason in science. And they think all of that is just one meta narrative. And it goes a long way to serve the interests of the powerful.
So in the sense that it's almost caricatured, but that is to the core of their belief that math could be racist, for example.
Oh, yeah,
Not
absolutely.
Not the education of math, but literally math, the mathematics.
The notion in math that there's a right answer and a wrong answer, that they believe is a meta narrative that serves white supremacy. Or in the postmodernists might have said it serves just the powerful or the wealthy. So what social justice fundamentalism is you take the Marxist thread that has been going on in lots of countries, and whoever the upper and lower is, that's what they all have in common. But the upper and lower, for Marx was the ruling class and the oppressed class. It was economic, but you come here and the economic class doesn't resonate as much here as it did maybe in some of those other places. But what does resonate here in the 60s and 70s is race and gender and these kind of social justice disagreements. And so what social justice fundamentalism is basically this tried and true framework of Marxist, this Marxist framework kind of with a new skin on it, which is American social justice. And then made even more radical with the infusion of postmodernism, where, not just is liberalism bad, but actually the science, the like you said, math can be racist. So it's this kind of like philosophical Frankenstein, this like stitched together of these. So again, it's called they wear the same uniform as the liberal social justice. They say social justice, right? Racial equality, but it has nothing to do with liberal social justice. It is directly opposed to liberal social justice.
This is fascinating. The evolution of ideas. If we ignore the harm done by it, it's fascinating how humans get together and evolve these ideas. So, as you show, Marxism is the idea that society is a zero sum. I mean, I guess zero sum is a really important thing here. Zero sum struggle between the ruling class and the working class, with power being exerted through politics and economics. Then you add critical theory, Marxism 2.0 on top of that, and you add to politics and economics, you add culture and institutions. And then on top of that, for postmodernism, you add science, you add morality, basically anything else you can think
to
of.
stitch together Frankenstein. And if you notice, and which is not necessarily bad, but in this case, I think it's actually violating the Marxist tradition by being anti-science.
Yes.
And it's violating the postmodernism, because what postmodernists were, they were radical skeptics, not just of the way things were, but of their own beliefs. Social justice fundamentalism is not at all self-critical. It says that we have the answers, which is the opposite of what postmodernists would ever say. They say, no, you just have another meta narrative. So, and it's also violating, of course, the tradition of like liberal social justice in a million ways, because it's anti-liberal. And so this Frankenstein comes together. Meanwhile, liberal social justice doesn't have a Frankenstein. It's very clear. It's a crisp ideology that says they're trying to get to a more perfect union. They're trying to keep the promises made in the Constitution. And that's what it's trying to do. And so it's much simpler in a lot of ways.
So you write that my big problem with social justice fundamentalism isn't the ideology itself. It's what its scholars and activists started to do sometimes around 2013, when they began to wield a cudgel that's not supposed to have any place in a country like the U.S. So it's the actions, not the ideas.
Well,
the
to be clear, I don't like the ideology.
Right.
I think it's a low-rung ideology. I think it's morally inconsistent based on, it's flip-flops on its morals depending on the group. I think it's echo chambery. I think it's I think it's full of inaccuracies and kind of can't stand up to debate. So I think it's a low, but there's a ton of low-rung ideologies I don't like. I don't like a lot of religious doctrines. I don't like a lot of political doctrines, right? The US is a place inherently that is a mishmash of a ton of ideologies, and I'm not going to like 2/3 of them at any given time. So my problem, and the reason I'm writing about this is not because I'm like, by the way, this ideology is not something I like. That's not interesting. The reason that it must be written about right now, this particular ideology, is because it's not playing nicely with others. If you want to be a hardcore, evangelical Christian, go in the US says live and let live. Not only are you allowed to have an echo chamber of some kind, it's actively protected here. Live and let live. They can do what they want. You do what you want. Now, if the evangelical Christians started saying, by the way, anyone who says anything that conflicts with evangelical Christianity is going to be severely socially punished, and they have the cultural power to do so, which they don't in this case. They might like to, but they don't have the power. But they're able to get anyone fired who they want, and they're able to actually change the curriculum in all of these schools and to suddenly not conflict with no more evolution in the textbooks because they don't want it. Now I would write a book about about evangelical Christianity, because that's what every liberal, regardless of what you think of the actual horizontal beliefs, doesn't matter what they believe, when they start violating live and let live and shutting down other segments of society, and in kind of, it's almost like a, it's not the best analogy, but it's like an echo chamber is like a benign tumor. And what you have to watch out for is a tumor that starts to metastasize, starts to forcefully spread and damage the tissue around it. And that's what this particular ideology has been doing.
Do you worry about it, as an existential threat to liberalism in the West, in the United States? Is it a problem, or is it the biggest problem that's threatening all of human civilization?
I would not say it's the biggest problem. It might be. I wouldn't, if it turns out in 50 years someone says actually it was, I wouldn't be shocked. But I wouldn't bet on that, because there's a lot of problems.
I'm a little sorry to interrupt. It is popular to say that kind of thing, though. And it's less popular to say the same thing about AI or nuclear weapons, which worries me, that I'm more worried about nuclear weapons even still than I am about wokeism.
So I've had probably 1,000 arguments about this. That's one nice thing about spending 6 years procrastinating on getting a book done, is you end up testing your ideas a million times. So I've heard this one a lot, right? Which is, there's kind of 3 groups of former Obama voters. One is super woke now.
Yeah.
Another one is super anti-woke now. And the third is what you just said, which is, sure, wokeness is over the top, right? You're not woke, but I think that the anti-woke people are totally lost their mind, and it's just not that big a deal, right? Now, here's why I disagree with that. Because it's not wokeness itself. It's that a radical political movement, of which there will always be a lot in the country, has managed to do something that a radical movement's not supposed to be able to do in the US, which is they've managed to hijack institutions all across the country and hijack medical journals and universities and, the ACLU, all the, activist organizations and nonprofits and
certain tech
NGOs.
companies.
Yeah. And many tech companies. And so it's not that I think this thing is so bad. It's a little like we said with Trump. It's that the reason Trump scares me is not because Trump's so bad. It's that because it shows, it reveals that we were vulnerable to a demagogue candidate. And what wokeness reveals to me is that we are currently, and until something changes, will continue to be vulnerable to a bully movement, and a forcefully expansionist movement that wants to actually destroy the workings, the liberal gears, and tear them apart. And so here's the way I view a liberal democracy: is it is a bunch of these institutions that were trial and error crafted over hundreds of years, and they all rely on trust, public trust, and a certain kind of feeling of unity that actually is critical to a liberal democracy's functioning. And what I see this thing is as a parasite on that whose goal is, and I'm not saying by the way, each individual in this is, I don't think they're bad people. I think that it's the ideology itself has the property of, its goal is to tear apart the pretty delicate workings of the liberal democracy and shred the critical lines of trust. And so you talk about AI and you talk about all these other big problems, nuclear, right? The reason I like writing about that stuff a lot more than I like writing about politics. This wasn't a fun topic for me, is because I realized that like all of those things, if we're going to have a good future with those things and they're actually threats, like I said, we need to have our wits about us, and we need the liberal, gears and levers working. We need the liberal machine working. And so if something's threatening to undermine that, it affects everything else.
We need to have our scientific mind about us, about these foundational ideas. But I guess my sense of hope comes from observing the immune system respond to wokeism. There seems to be a pro-liberalism immune system. And not only that, so like there's intellectuals, there's people that are willing to do the fight. You talk about courage, or being courageous. And there is a hunger for that, such that those ideas can become viral and they take over. So I just don't see a mechanism by which wokeism accelerates like exponentially and takes over, like it expands. It feels like as it expands, the immune system responds. The immune system of liberalism, of basically a country, at least in the United States, that still ultimately at the core of the individual values the freedom of speech, just freedoms in general. The freedom of an individual, but that's the battle. Which
Totally
is stronger.
agree. So to me, it is like a virus and an immune system.
Yeah,
and I totally agree. I see the same story happening, and I'm sitting here rooting for the immune system.
Mm-hmm. But you're still worried.
Well, here's the thing. So a liberal democracy is always going to be vulnerable to a movement like this, right? And there will be more, because it's not a totalitarian dictatorship. Because if you can socially pressure people to not say what they're thinking, you can suddenly start to just take over, right? You can break the liberalism of the liberal democracy quite easily, and suddenly a lot of things are illiberal. On the other hand, the same vulnerability, the same system that's vulnerable to that also is hard to truly conquer. Because now the Maoists, right, similar kind of vibe. They were saying that science is evil, and is a and that they're the intellectuals are it's all this big conspiracy. But they could murder you, and they had the hard cudgel in their hand, right? And the hard cudgel is scary, and you can conquer a country with the hard cudgel, but you can't use that in the U.S. So what they have is a soft cudgel, which can have the same effect initially. You can scare people into shutting up. You can't maybe imprison them and murder them, but if you can socially ostracize them and get them fired, that basically is going to have the same effect. So the soft cudgel can have the same effect for a while, but the thing is, it's a little bit of a house of cards, because it relies on fear. And as soon as that fear goes away, the whole thing falls apart, right? The soft cudgel requires people to be so scared of getting canceled or getting whatever. And as soon as some people start, Toby Lutka of Shopify, I always think about, he just said, I'm not scared of this soft cudgel, and spoke up and said, we're not political at this company, and we're not a family, we're a team, and we're going to do this. And you know what? They're thriving.
He will be on this podcast. He seems like a fascinating human being.
He's amazing.
He spoke up. He's saying
he's one of the smartest and kindest dudes, but he's also, he has courage at a time when it's hard. But here's the thing, is that it's different than that. You need so much less courage against a soft cudgel than you do. The Iranians throwing their hijabs into the fire, yeah. Those people's courage just blows away any courage we have here, because they might get executed. That's the thing, is that you can actually have courage right now. And it's so.
I'm sure I understand.
Don't worry about it.
Oh, man. The irony of that. And you talk about, so two things to fight this. There's two things: awareness and courage. What's the awareness piece?
The awareness piece is first just understanding the stakes, like getting our heads out of the sand and being like, look, technology is blowing up exponentially. Our society's trust is devolving. Like we're kind of falling apart in some important ways. We're losing our grip on some stability at the worst time. That's the first point, just the big picture. And then also awareness of, I think, this vertical axis or whatever your version of it is, this concept of how do I really form my beliefs? Where do they actually come from? Where do, are they someone else's beliefs? Am I following a checklist? How about my values? I used to identify with the blue party or the red party, but now they've changed, and I suddenly am okay with that. Is that because my values changed with it, or am I actually anchored to the party, not to any principle? Asking yourself these questions, looking for where do I feel disgusted by fellow human beings? That maybe I'm being a crazy tribal person without realizing it. How about the people around me? Am I being bullied by some echo chamber without realizing it? Am I the bully somewhere? Right. So that's the first thing. Just to kind of do a self audit, and I think that like just some awareness like that, and just a self audit about these things can go a long way. But if you keep it to yourself, it's almost useless, because if you don't have awareness without courage does very little. So courage is when you take that awareness and you actually export it out into the world and it starts affecting other people. And so courage can happen on multiple levels. It can happen by, first of all, just stop saying stuff you don't believe. If you're being pressured by a kind of a ideology or a movement to say stuff that you don't actually believe, just stop, just stand your ground and don't say anything. That's courage. That's one first step. Start speaking out in small groups. Start, actually speaking your mind, see what happens. The sky doesn't usually fall. Actually, people usually respect you for it. And it's not every group, but you'd be surprised. And then eventually, maybe start speaking out in bigger groups, start going public, go public with it. And you don't need everyone doing this. Look, some people will lose their jobs for it. I'm not talking to those people. Most people won't lose their jobs, but they have the same fear as if they would, right? And it's like, what, are you going to get criticized? Or are you going to get a bunch of people, angry Twitter people will criticize you? It's not pleasant, but actually that's a little bit like our primitive mind's fear that really, back when it was programmed, that kind of ostracism or criticism will leave you out of the tribe and you'll die. Today, it's kind of a delusional fear. It's not actually that scary. And the people who have realized that can exercise incredible leadership right now.